The moment my mother-in-law slid the folder across the dining table toward me, it didn't feel like a suggestion or the start of a conversation. It felt like a decision already finalized somewhere else, now placed in front of me for execution. The room didn't fall silent all at once, but the shift was immediate enough to notice. Conversations thinned, movements slowed, until the kind of quiet settled in that only happens when people are waiting for something they already understand. I didn't reach for the folder immediately. I looked at Daniel instead. Whatever this was, it had his name written all over it, whether he chose to acknowledge it or not. For a second, I expected him to meet my eyes, to say something that would interrupt the direction this moment was taking. But he didn't. He focused on his glass, adjusting it slightly in his hand, as if it required more attention than the situation in front of him. That quiet avoidance wasn't hesitation. It was confirmation. Only then did I reach for the folder, slow and deliberate. Not out of fear, but because I understood that rushing through something like this is exactly how you lose control of it. I've never been careless with things that carry consequences. As I opened it, I became aware of the room again, not through noise, but through absence. No one interrupted. No one questioned. No one reacted. That told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been decided before it reached me. The first page confirmed it. Divorce papers. Complete, notarized, dated in advance. Structured in a way that made it clear this wasn't being discussed. It was being carried out. For a brief moment, I considered doing what most people would do in that situation. Pushing back, asking questions, refusing to accept something so controlled and public. But the truth is, when something has been arranged this carefully, reacting emotionally doesn't stop it. It only hands over whatever control you still have left. So, I didn't react. I stayed where I was and kept reading, line by line, slowly. I made sure I understood every detail before allowing myself to respond. Across from me, my mother-in-law didn't move. She wasn't watching for a reaction. She wasn't waiting for a response. She was simply observing the process unfold the way she had intended it to. Her posture remained steady. Her expression calm. Not neutral, but resolved, like this moment wasn't uncertain to her. It was necessary. "I've already had everything reviewed," she said, her voice even controlled. It carried a quiet authority that doesn't need to be raised to be followed. "You'll find the terms are clear." It wasn't reassurance. It was instruction. I didn't respond. I kept reading. Whatever she had decided didn't change what was written, and what was written didn't change what I needed to understand before doing anything else. The house, the settlement, the conditions, every detail placed exactly where it needed to be. Not emotional, not messy. Just structured. When I reached the final page, I paused for a moment. Not out of uncertainty, but because I fully understood what this was. This wasn't happening in that room. It had already happened. I was just the last step required to make it official. I looked at Daniel again. This time he met my eyes briefly before looking away. That was enough to confirm what I already knew. I picked up the pen and signed. One page, then the next. I took my time, not rushing, not hesitating. Just completing what had been placed in front of me. No one stopped me. No one questioned it. Because this wasn't a moment anyone intended to interrupt. To understand why that dinner didn't feel sudden, you have to go back a little. Nothing about that moment actually started there. It had been taking shape long before that night, just in ways easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. I met Daniel at a friend's birthday party in downtown Chicago. It was the kind of place where everything feels effortless and uncomplicated, where conversations flow naturally, and people present themselves at their best. He was easy to talk to. Steady in a way that felt reassuring at the time, like someone who understood direction and didn't get lost in uncertainty. He spoke about his family often, but what stood out wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, especially about his mother. There was a level of respect that went beyond affection. Something closer to alignment, as if her decisions had always shaped more than just the household. At the time, I didn't question it. I assumed it meant he came from a strong, well-structured family, the kind where things are organized, intentional, stable. We dated for about a year and a half before he proposed. During that time, everything felt normal. The kind of normal that doesn't raise questions because there's no immediate reason to doubt it. Looking back, I can see small moments that didn't quite fit, details that didn't align perfectly. But nothing strong enough to stand out on its own. Nothing urgent enough to confront. The first time I met his parents was at their house in Naperville, a place that didn't feel accidental in any way. Everything was carefully arranged, maintained, controlled. His father greeted me first, polite, measured, brief, almost procedural, like formality mattered more than connection. His mother, however, approached differently, slower, more deliberate. Her attention focused in a way that made it clear she wasn't just meeting me, she was assessing me. Her questions were calm, almost conversational, but precise. Each one placed carefully, building a picture rather than passing time. Dinner followed the same pattern. His father spoke, but he didn't lead, not really. The rhythm of the conversation, the direction it took, even the topic shifts, all moved around her. Subtle enough that you wouldn't notice unless you were paying attention. Controlled enough that nothing drifted too far off course. Daniel sat beside me, mostly quiet, occasionally adding something, but never redirecting the flow already in place. At the time, I read it as calmness. Someone who didn't feel the need to dominate. Now I understand it differently. I told myself it was normal. Some families operate with a certain structure. Not everything has to feel casual to be comfortable. And when nothing is openly wrong, when no one crosses a line clearly enough to call it out, it becomes very easy to convince yourself that everything is fine. We got married when I was 30. I had my own career, my own clients, my own independence. I didn't walk into marriage blindly. But there's a difference between understanding independence and recognizing control when it presents itself gradually, in ways that don't demand attention immediately. The first time the topic of children came up, it wasn't pressure. It was introduced carefully during dinner, in a tone that felt almost casual. His mother asked, not pushing, just placing the question like it naturally belonged. I answered simply. We weren't in a rush. We wanted time and space, a chance to settle before the next step. She nodded. It wasn't agreement. Not really. It felt like acknowledgement. Something noted and set aside, not dismissed. After that, it didn't disappear. It returned, not all at once, but consistently. In conversations, passing remarks. Quiet follow-ups that didn't feel accidental. His father echoed parts occasionally, but never initiated it. The direction always came from her. She began sending articles, not aggressively, not instructions. Quietly, just enough to keep the topic present, so it never fully left the conversation. Daniel stayed out of it. He didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't shut it down. He just let it continue, as if it wasn't significant enough to intervene. About a year into our marriage, I found out I had a medical condition that might complicate things. Not prevent them, just make them less predictable. I told Daniel first. He responded exactly how I needed. Calm, supportive, reassuring. Saying it didn't change anything. That we had time. That we would handle it together. For a while, I believed that was enough. Slowly, however, the tone around me shifted. Questions became more pointed, less casual. The timing of conversations felt less random. His mother's approach became more direct, controlled but no longer distant. His father followed her lead, reinforcing what had been set in motion. And Daniel remained the same, present, but passive. Part of everything, but never in a way that changed its direction. Looking back, that's where it all began. Not in one defining moment, not in something obvious, but in the accumulation of small, controlled steps that led everything exactly where it was always intended to go. Because by the time that folder reached me, this wasn't a decision being made. It was a plan being completed. About 14 months into our marriage, I got a call from my doctor. I remember it clearly, not because of exact words, but because of how they shifted everything around me. It wasn't extreme, nothing final, nothing that couldn't be managed. But it disrupted the timeline that had already been quietly forming around me without being discussed. I sat in my car after the appointment, not reacting immediately, just letting the information settle piece by piece, trying to understand what it meant and what it didn't. Then I called my mother. She listens before she speaks. Afterwards, I went home and told Daniel. He responded exactly the way I needed. Calm, attentive, saying all the right things without hesitation. That nothing had changed, that we had time, that we would figure it out together. And I believed him. Not because I was convincing myself, but because there was nothing in his response to doubt. For a while, everything appeared the same. No confrontation, no immediate shift. No moment you could point to and say this is where things changed. But underneath, something had already started to move, showing up in ways easy to overlook. His mother was the first to adjust. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be called out, but in timing, frequency, and precision. Her messages didn't stop. They became more targeted, more intentional. Articles turned into suggestions. Suggestions into quiet follow-ups. Each one placed carefully. So ignoring them didn't stop them from accumulating. His father didn't initiate anything new. He reinforced what had been set in motion. His comments less casual, more aligned. What used to feel like passing remarks started to carry weight, not because they were louder, but because they were consistent. And Daniel stayed exactly where he had always been. Present, but removed. Listening, but not engaging. Every time the conversation edged toward something requiring clarity, he let it pass. Stepping aside was easier than choosing a position. At first, I told myself it was harmless. That he was avoiding unnecessary conflict. That not everything needed discussion, that sometimes silence kept things stable. Over time, that silence stopped feeling neutral. It started to feel like something missing. Something that should have been there, but wasn't. One moment stayed with me. Not dramatic, but fleeting. I was in the kitchen one evening while Daniel was in the living room on a call. I wasn't trying to listen, but his voice shifted just enough for me to notice. By the time I moved closer, he had already redirected the conversation. I caught one sentence before it disappeared completely. I don't know yet. I just don't know. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't someone figuring something out. It was someone avoiding an answer they already had. I didn't question him. I could have, but I didn't. I let it go as I had with other small things before, telling myself it wasn't enough to become something bigger. But I remembered it. The second year of our marriage didn't collapse all at once. It shifted gradually, in ways difficult to explain unless you lived inside them. Invitations to family dinners started coming through Daniel instead of me. They didn't feel like invitations. They felt like arrangements that had already been made. Timing wasn't discussed. It was assigned. Presence wasn't requested. It was expected. Conversations that used to include both of us started happening separately. His father spoke directly to him about things that once involved me. But even then, it didn't feel like he was leading, only continuing. The direction had already been set. His mother remained consistent, controlled, present in ways that didn't require her to be physically there. Messages, reminders, subtle adjustments in tone, they continued without interruption. A kind of pressure that never needed to be raised to be effective. Every time something felt slightly off, I minimized it. Told myself I was overthinking. Told myself if something truly mattered, it would be said directly. Only two people didn't let me ignore it completely. My mother, who quietly listened without forcing conclusions, and Sophie, who saw things differently. She worked in family law, and over time, the way she spoke to me began to shift, not dramatically, but enough to notice. "I'm not saying anything is wrong," she said once. "I'm just saying you should understand how things work." Just in case. I dismissed it at the time, telling her she was overthinking. Not every situation turns complicated. She didn't argue. Didn't try to convince me. She just explained calmly, clearly, making sure I wouldn't walk in unprepared. I didn't think I would ever need that information. But I didn't forget it. Looking back now, that period feels different. Not because of something obvious, but because of everything that wasn't said, conversations that never happened. Questions never asked directly. Answers avoided instead of given. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was controlled. And by the time Thanksgiving came, the dinner everyone later pointed to as the moment everything fell apart, I had already begun to understand that something wasn't right. I just didn't realize how far it had already gone. The Thanksgiving dinner that year wasn't casual. It had been planned in advance with a level of precision that made it feel less like a family gathering and more like something structured for a purpose. My mother-in-law had arranged everything herself, from the private dining room to the guest list and even the seating. And although on the surface it could still pass as normal, it didn't feel that way. It felt controlled, like nothing had been left to chance. There were more than 20 people in the room, conversations overlapping and glasses clinking, creating the kind of atmosphere that should have felt warm but didn't quite reach that point. I wore a navy dress, kept everything simple, and moved through the room the way you do when you understand you're being observed more than included, answering questions, smiling when expected, playing a role that had already been assigned to me. Sophie was there, seated a few chairs away from me, quieter than usual but focused, and at one point she leaned slightly toward me and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but the way she nodded and said, "Just stay like that tonight," didn't sound casual, it sounded deliberate. Like she wasn't giving advice but preparing me for something she already suspected. Dinner began the way these things always do, with conversations about work, the city, and things that fill space without meaning much, while Daniel sat beside me quieter than usual, responding when spoken to but never leading anything or shifting the direction. My father-in-law spoke when needed, but he wasn't in control, not really, because the rhythm of the evening, the pacing, and even the way conversations moved all followed her. My mother-in-law guided everything without making it obvious, adjusting attention, maintaining flow, keeping the room exactly where she wanted it. Nothing was openly wrong, but nothing felt natural either. And by the time the main course ended, that same quiet tension had settled in again, subtle but impossible to ignore. That was when she stood up, and without raising her voice or asking for attention, the room adjusted on its own as conversations faded and focus shifted toward her. She lifted her glass slightly and began to speak about family, tradition, and responsibility, and although the words sounded familiar, the way she delivered them made it clear this wasn't just a speech, it was a setup. Her gaze moved across the table, and when it reached me, it paused just long enough to make the intention clear before she said, "Sometimes we have to make decisions that aren't easy, not because we want to, but because they are necessary." And it didn't sound like an observation. It sounded like a conclusion that had already been reached. Then, without changing her tone, she reached beside her chair, brought out a folder, and placed it on the table before sliding it toward me. She said she had already taken care of everything and that all that was left was for me to go through it. And it wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive. The room didn't react out loud, but the silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was recognition, the kind that comes when most people already know what's happening and are just waiting for it to be completed. I didn't reach for the folder immediately. I looked at Daniel first, but he was already looking down, and in that moment everything became clear because this wasn't something happening around him. It was something happening with him. I picked up the folder and opened it, and the first page confirmed what I already understood before reading a single word. Divorce papers, complete and formal, already signed on one side, and waiting for me to make them final. I didn't react. I read line by line slowly, making sure I understood every detail, from the house to the settlement to the timeline. Everything structured carefully to look reasonable, like this was simply an agreement being concluded rather than something being dismantled in front of a room full of people. My mother-in-law stated calmly that everything had already been reviewed, and that there was nothing unclear, and I replied quietly that I knew what it said before turning another page. And that was when the shift in the room became noticeable, not because of what I said, but because of what I didn't do. I didn't argue. I didn't question. I didn't resist. When I reached the final page, I paused briefly, and before I could close the folder, she added that there was one more thing. I followed her gaze toward the entrance, and someone was already there. A woman stepped into the room, composed and controlled, moving without hesitation as if she already belonged there. And when she stopped beside Daniel and leaned slightly toward him, I noticed the earrings because I had seen them before and they belonged to my mother-in-law. She introduced her as Vanessa and mentioned that they had known each other for a long time, and no explanation followed because none was needed. The room remained silent, not out of confusion, but because it already understood. I didn't ask questions or look for clarification because everything about the moment had already explained itself. And instead I lowered my gaze back to the papers, picked up the pen and signed, one page after the next, steady and controlled. The sound of the pen against paper cutting through the silence because no one else was speaking. When I finished, I closed the folder and slid it back across the table, then looked at Daniel and told him that he could have told me that it was all I ever needed. But he didn't respond, and I didn't wait for him to. I pushed my chair back slightly, ready to leave, but before I could move, Sophie spoke and said that before I left, there was something they should see. And as the room shifted again, she reached into her jacket, took out a small brown envelope, and placed it on the table before sliding it forward, not toward Daniel and not toward me, but toward my mother-in-law. And for the first time that night, the control in the room hesitated. For a moment, no one moved after Sophie slid the envelope across the table, but the shift in the room was immediate, subtle yet undeniable, as if something carefully controlled had slipped out of alignment. The tension didn't explode, it recalibrated, and for the first time that night, the certainty that had been holding everything together no longer felt unshakable. My mother-in-law was the first to react, not by speaking, but by looking at the envelope as if it didn't belong in the space she had so deliberately structured. And even that hesitation carried weight because up until that point she had been in control of every detail, every moment, every reaction in the room. "What is this?" she asked, her voice still composed, but missing the quiet authority it had carried earlier. "Open it," Sophie replied calmly, placing the decision back in her hands without forcing it. There was a brief pause before she picked it up, not out of curiosity but because not doing so would have meant losing control in front of everyone watching. And as she opened it, the faint sound of paper shifting cut through the silence more sharply than it should have. I didn't look at the envelope. I watched her. At first, nothing changed. Her expression remained composed, her posture steady. But then her eyes slowed as they moved across the page again, more carefully this time, and that was where it started to show. Not dramatically, but in the smallest shift that only becomes visible when something doesn't align with expectation. She pulled out the first document and read it again, as if trying to confirm something she didn't want to misunderstand. It was a medical record, a procedure done years ago, long before I was part of this family, something private and permanent that had never once been mentioned, not even when it mattered most. Daniel's name was printed clearly at the top. No one spoke, but the silence had changed. It was no longer controlled. It was uncertain. Then she reached for the second document, and this time the reaction was different because she didn't reread it or take her time. She just looked at it and went completely still, as if the meaning had landed all at once and left no room for interpretation. I already knew what it was. Sophie had shown me both documents days earlier, sitting across from me and explaining everything with calm clarity, making sure I understood every implication before I stepped into that room. And she hadn't told me what to do because she didn't need to. She just made sure I wouldn't walk in unprepared. Now my mother-in-law looked up slowly, but instead of looking at me, she looked at Daniel first, searching for something that could restore the version of reality she had been so certain about. "Is this accurate?" she asked, but it wasn't really a question. It was an attempt to hold on to control. "It is," Sophie answered before anyone else could speak. "Both of them." The room didn't react. It absorbed. "You had a vasectomy," I said, looking directly at Daniel, not asking or accusing, just stating what had always been true whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Before we ever met, he didn't respond, and he didn't need to. For 2 years, I had sat in rooms like this, listening to conversations that slowly and subtly placed responsibility on me for something no one had fully understood, something that had never been questioned in the right direction, and the entire time, he had known. The second document shifted slightly in her hand. "I'm pregnant," I said, just as evenly, letting the words settle exactly where they needed to. That was the moment everything broke, not in noise or chaos, but in structure. Because the narrative that had guided every decision and every assumption no longer held together, and there was no way to rebuild it fast enough to recover control. Daniel finally looked up, his expression no longer neutral, something unsettled breaking through in a way that couldn't be hidden. "Rachel," he started. "Don't," I said quietly, stopping him before he could say anything that didn't matter anymore. Then I shifted my attention back to her, and for the first time that night, she wasn't composed, not visibly shaken, but no longer in control the way she had been from the beginning. "For 2 years, you built a narrative around something that was never true," I said steadily. "You questioned me, you pushed, you decided what the outcome should be, and he let you." No one interrupted because no one could. The truth was no longer hidden in assumptions or controlled conversations. It was sitting in the middle of the table, exactly where it should have been from the beginning. For a few seconds after that, no one spoke. But the silence had completely changed. It was no longer shaped or directed. It was uncertain. Like the structure holding everything together had quietly collapsed and no one knew how to rebuild it. Vanessa spoke first, her voice soft and careful, saying she didn't know. And when I looked at her, there was no tension left, no resentment. Just the quiet understanding that she hadn't been given the full truth either. I told her I believed her because I did. I reached for my bag, not in a rush, just moving forward in the only way that still made sense, because the papers were signed, the truth had settled. And there was nothing left in that room that belonged to me anymore. "You should have told me," I said to Daniel, my voice steady. "That's all it would have taken." He didn't answer, and this time, it didn't matter. Then I looked at her again, and for the first time since the evening began, there was no certainty left in her eyes, just the realization that something she had built so carefully no longer held. "I'm not part of this anymore," I said, not as defiance, just as fact. No one tried to stop me. I stepped away from the table, and Sophie stood up immediately, falling into step beside me without a word, and together we walked out of the room, past conversations that hadn't restarted yet, past a moment that no longer belonged to me, and into the hallway where the air finally felt separate from everything that had just happened. Outside, the cold hit instantly, sharp and grounding, and I stopped for a moment, not because I didn't know what came next, but because for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to figure it out immediately. "You okay?" Sophie asked. "I don't know yet," I said, and that was enough. Some things don't resolve in a moment, some things just end, and you understand them later. The divorce was finalized a few months later without turning into something dramatic, because once everything had come to light, the version of events that had once held weight no longer stood the same way. I moved forward quietly, without explanations or justifications, just decisions made on my own terms, while my mother stayed with me for a while and Sophie remained exactly who she had always been, steady and present without needing anything in return. As for Daniel, I heard things occasionally, small updates about where he was and how things turned out, but none of it felt connected to me anymore because it wasn't. Not every ending feels like loss, some of them feel like clarity. And when I think back to that night now, it's not the folder or the silence that stays with me the most. It's the fact that everything that had been left unsaid was finally spoken. And once that happens, there's nothing left that can hold you in a place you've already outgrown.